Good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to see lots of you here tonight. I'm Anna Renderson, as Brian said. I'm Director of the Centre for Research in Autism and Education. CRAE is a team of autistic and non-autistic students and staff based within the IOE, UCL's Faculty of Education and Society, and part of the Department of Psychology and Human Development. We aim to conduct cutting-edge research, but also to make sure that the results of that research reach those who stand to benefit from them. And through everything that we do, we take a participatory approach, which means that we work with autistic people at every stage of our research and initiatives, right from the initial design through to interpreting the outcomes. And we hope that this means that the work that we do is meaningful for the autistic community. At this point, I'd like to say a big thank you to all of our funders, supporters and team members for making everything that we do possible. And a particular special thank you to Pears Foundation for their ongoing generosity that underpins everything that we do. Tonight I'm delighted to be hosting the book launch of 9 Minds by Daniel Tammet. I was lucky enough to receive an advance copy of 9 Minds, and I've enjoyed it so much. In the book, Daniel tells the beautiful true stories about each of his 9 chosen characters. He paints a vivid picture of their lives, and it's so fascinating to read. The part I found particularly lovely was the way in which Daniel also weaves his own relationship with each person into the story, explaining how he forged a connection with them and how the chapter came to be. So Daniel, I'm going to steal the technique tonight and spend a couple of minutes sharing a similar story. It was a cold, rainy day in 2007. That's a long time ago, but I know it was cold and rainy because every day is cold and rainy here. A young autism researcher was doing her PhD work on attentional perception. Everyone had been talking about attentional deficits and disorders, but her and her supervisors weren't so sure. Every task they used showed a different pattern. The autistic participants were better than the non-autistic participants. For the researcher, it was the start of a long-running program of research, almost 2 decades now, of strengths-based research, trying to understand what might be underpinning some of the advantages, and trying to understand whether better knowledge about strengths could help support challenging situations that autistic people may encounter, such as sensory sensitivities or experiencing overwhelming distractions. The work led to a new theory of how perception differs for autistic people compared to non-autistic people. It's centered around the idea of perceptual capacity, the amount of information that we can process at any given time. The research showed that autistic people have a greater perceptual capacity than non-autistic people, and that this might explain some of the positive and negative aspects of the autistic experience. For example, if you have increased perceptual capacity and you're doing a task that has lots of information in it, then that extra capacity is going to be really useful and allow you to be more efficient and perform better, more productive on that task. On the other hand, if you're doing a task that doesn't involve much information, that's quite simple, then having the extra capacity can actually make it harder to stay focused on tasks, because the extra capacity automatically spills over and processes anything else going on around you. Or if there's nothing external, then it will turn inwards and lead to more mind-wandering, rumination, dwelling on your own thoughts. The young researcher began to give public talks to reframe the understanding of autistic attentional differences in light of this new approach. She hoped that raising awareness of strengths as well as challenges would help empower autistic people to better understand their sensory experiences, and also to reshape how non-autistic people understood and viewed those on the autistic spectrum. As part of those presentations, she would talk about a young linguist and writer, not much older than her, who could speak 10 languages, demonstrate amazing feats of memory, could recite pi to 22,514 digits. This, she said, was a perfect example of very increased perceptual capacity, but she was also quick to stress that increased perceptual capacity is not something that's limited to some individuals, but was seen for the general autistic population. Over the next 15 or so years, the PhD researcher continued to investigate these attentional skills and the practical application of the perceptual capacity differences, looking at attention, employment, for example. She became more senior, became director of a research centre, and enjoyed supervising her own PhD students. But throughout, in all her presentations and lectures, she still talked about Daniel Tammet and his amazing skills. One of her PhD students was Kaa Grace, a talented autistic researcher who was investigating loneliness. In November 2021, Kaa had some exciting news. She was going to be featured in a book, exciting in its own right, but the book was written by Daniel Tammet, even more exciting. The now not so young researcher was a bit busy at the point of hearing the news. She had just left the hospital after the birth of her second son. An announcement about Kaa's involvement in the book was actually excitedly shared with the researcher's team right under the announcement in the weekly news email about the new arrival. On account of being a bit distracted by nappies, she forgot all about it for about 2.5 years, when an equally exciting email arrived. An email from Daniel Tammet himself. Might the Research Centre be interested in hosting a launch for his new book? As you've probably guessed by now, the researcher is me, and I am honoured and privileged to be standing here with Daniel tonight. Daniel, I have been so inspired by your achievements and your experiences. They have had such an impact on me and my work. I am thrilled to see, via your links with Kaa, the thread of connection between you and CRAE that's been woven over the past few years. And on that note, I'm delighted to hand over and invite you to the stage to talk about your wonderful new book, 9 Lives.
So thank you, Emma, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to CRAE and everyone here for helping to host this event this evening. I'm going to speak a little bit about myself, first and foremost. I'm assuming some of you are familiar with my story, but in case you're not, or in case you're familiar with some aspects and not others, it might be useful to start with that introduction, after which I'll introduce my latest book, 9 Minds, and then there's a short video with Kaa, one of the 9 minds featured in the book, and then I'll talk about 1 or 2 other minds. I don't have the time perhaps to go through all 9 of them, but they're all equally fascinating, but I'll certainly discuss 2 or 3 of them. So I'm Daniel Tammet. I was born and raised in London, in England. My parents were very modest, came from a very working class background, but had lots of love, which was very the most important quality in parenting, and lots of instincts. They trusted their instincts, and they entrusted me to those instincts. I was a very difficult child in certain respects. This is going back, so this is the early 80s, for example, very early 80s, which at that time, autism was something that nobody talked about, other than perhaps a few scientists in Germany, for example, and perhaps in America as well. I'm sure there were some scientists in Britain, obviously, but it was a very academic subject. There was very little, if any, public awareness of autism. Neurodiversity was obviously a word that was very far in the future, and so my parents had no opportunity to know what was going on. I also had epilepsy as a small child, which is something that's unfortunately very common for people on the spectrum. So I had seizures. I was lucky insofar as my father recognized immediately that his own father had epilepsy. So his instincts saved my life, quite literally at one moment. And so and then getting older, it's probably worth saying that I'm the oldest of 9 children. So lots and lots of early life stimulation, which, as we know now, is very, very important for the life opportunities for autistic children. So this was something that my parents did instinctively. There was no forethought, there was no planning, there was simply, I was raised by all these wonderful brothers and sisters who respected me simply because although I was very different, and often in my mind and often in my own world, in some ways they respected me, they loved me. I was their big brother, so that was very important. I went to standard schools, I was very lucky insofar as the teachers were very indulgent of my eccentricities. I would go into the playground and I would talk to the trees, or at least that's what people thought I was doing, because I would go up to the trees and I would admire the bark and the texture of the bark. I would look at the light and how the light was sparkling in the leaves. And I would try to find a word to articulate what I was feeling, because I've always had a very fusional relationship with words, as with numbers as well. And I would, so for example, my second home was the library. I would just spend ages, hours after school and weekends going into the library and reading books and reading books and reading books. And so I would be absorbing all of these words, not necessarily knowing all the time what the words meant, but admiring them for their texture or colour, because for me, words and numbers have colours and textures and emotions. So for example, if I were to see the bark on a tree and it was kind of flaky, then I would say a word like cuffing, because that was a word that feels flaky to me. And so I didn't necessarily know at 6 or 7 what cufflink was, but it was just a word, the texture of the word that matched the texture of the tree bark. So, and the children would be observing me at school, observing, and the teachers as well. And the teachers would indulge this, and the children indulged it less, because children obviously at every age, they want to fit in, they want to be like the other children, they want to be the cool kids. And I was never the cool kid, obviously. And so they would tease me, they would mock me. I would do hand flapping, I would clap my hands, kind of stimulation, self-stimulation, I guess it was to navigate those emotions I was feeling. And if I was very excited and I couldn't speak, I would bring my hands to my mouth and I would clap my hands and so on. And the children would imitate me doing this, would mock me, by doing this in return. And my mum was very protective of me, as mums tend to be, of their children. And so she would come into the school like a cat among the pigeons, and she would, say to the children, don't you ever, tease my son, don't you ever, bully my child. So the message was very clear. And similarly, the teachers were just very kind, because they found in me someone who was very, in fact, a very good student. I was very quiet in class when I wasn't dozing because of the epilepsy medication I was on. I was very attentive. I loved listening to the teachers. I loved learning about numbers, about words. Sometimes I corrected my teachers if they made mistakes, but they were very happy. They accepted that. They weren't, put out, luckily. When I would go into the library and read all these books, one memory stands out in particular I want to share with you, which is that I remember the very first time I went into the library and there were books everywhere. And I don't remember how old I was very small. And the books all had names on them. And I would walk around. I couldn't obviously see all of the books, I wasn't tall enough, but the books I could see all had different names on them. And I would walk around and I would look at all the names. And I was looking, even before I realized what I was doing, I was actually looking for my name on the books and not finding it. And even though it was alphabetical, and as I was looking in where it should be, but it wasn't there. And of course I was imagining that everyone had a book, and it only needed us to go to the spot in the library and find it, and we would have that book, and we would open it. I would open it. This was my idea. I would open the book at the end, because I don't like surprises very often, and I would know what was going to happen in my life, and that way I could anticipate, I could plan ahead, I could perhaps even swerve and I'm trying to find a word in English. I've got the word in French. tromper mon destin. I would cheat destiny. And so I would, and of course I never did find a book, and it took me quite a while to realize why that was. And it's wonderful to imagine today, all those years later now, I'm a published writer, 9 Minds is my 10th book. I've been writing for 20 years now, and those books have been translated into 30 languages. So in libraries and bookshops all around the world, I finally got my name on these books. And so yes, I would be reading all these books. And one of the reasons I was reading so much was because I was trying to get into the minds of other people. I was trying to understand how people's minds work. That was very difficult for me to understand. Reading was a way of doing that, because in a book you literally read other people's thoughts. In terms of the dialogue in a novel, for example, you can see the words, and you can say, okay, so this is how people think. This is what they're saying to themselves. It's reassuring in a way, because you say, okay, this is actually quite similar to what I'm doing in a way. There are words in my mind, there are reactions, there are emotions that I immediately recognize: fear, pride, hope, love, and then at the same time there were things like grief. That was harder for me to understand. I was perhaps lucky in a way, because I didn't lose a grandparent until I was 12, and I didn't even know that there was such a thing as death until I was 9, I think. We didn't have pets growing up, when I was growing up, so I didn't lose a pet, for example. And I remember that I realized that death was a thing when I saw Hirohito, the funeral of Hirohito, the Japanese emperor. I think it was in January 1989 or 88, 1989, I think it was. And so I saw these people weeping, and people dressed in black, and I remember asking my parents what this was about and explaining to me, and I said, okay, so this is a thing. And when my grandfather passed away 2 years later, I said, okay, so he's caught the Japanese illness, which is called death. And so I was grappling with these concepts, which were not evident for any of us actually, which is what makes us want, those of us who have that vocation to write, pushes us to write books, because we're grappling with these issues, and we know that everyone else is on some level, and we want to share those experiences and those insights and those intuitions, and have that dialogue with our readers. And so I was reading, and I was learning all of this, and I was going into the playground, and I was talking to the children and trying to find the words from the books, the words that I could use so the children would understand me, and they never did understand me because I was talking like a book and not like a child of my age. And so I would go back to the library assuming that it was the book's fault, that the writer was not very good, that the dialogue was not realistic enough, and if I only found better written dialogue, I would be able to talk to the other children in a way that they would understand. And of course, this didn't really work out, but I was learning, even though it didn't pan out. I was learning this from this back and forth, how I was meant to be learning to speak. All of this means that growing up, I always felt like a foreigner. I didn't feel like I was English, even though English was the only language my parents had, and the only language I heard for a long time. The first time I heard another language was the day that we had a lady move in 2 doors down from us. And she was from Finland. She had a daughter. And a daughter of my sister's age, a little bit younger than me. I was perhaps 9 or 10. And the daughter was English speaking. She actually hadn't been raised to speak Finnish, only English. Her father was Scottish, and he didn't want the daughter, I guess, speaking a language he didn't understand, which is a shame, because we know now how wonderful bilingualism is for children's brains. And in many respects, bilingualism is a gift. But the daughter was very adamant that she didn't want to speak Finnish, and for all of the mother's efforts, she she didn't want to do this. So she had a picture book in Finnish and she just gave it to my sister because she didn't want it. And my sister didn't know what to do with this picture book in Finnish, so she gave it to me, knowing my love for words. And I opened the pages and I saw this beautiful apple and I saw the word in Finnish underneath, omina. And I just thought, this is an incredible way of describing an apple, omina. And then I turned the page and I saw a shoe, a beautiful picture for a shoe, with the word kenka, which means shoe in Finnish, obviously. And I thought to myself, well, I almost couldn't distinguish the picture from the word, because words are colours and pictures in their own right to me. So kenka is a beautiful golden word. And I thought, well, this is so beautiful. And I was turning the pages and there was a picture of a house and the Finnish word underneath the house, talo. And I thought to myself, I would love to live in this house. I would love to live in the house of the Finnish language. I would feel at home in Finnish in a way that I didn't in my own native language. Because fundamentally, I guess, my mother tongue, or at least the language that came in most naturally to me, wasn't English or Finnish or French or German that I would go on to learn and learn well at school. One reason why I've lived in France for many years. But the language of numbers, because numbers having colours and shapes and textures for me as well, I loved playing with them in my mind. They were like my first friends. 4 is a shy number, for example. 11 is beautiful. 89, it's like falling snow. 4007 is a prime number. You can only divide it by itself and 1. And it's blue in a very beautiful, shimmering blue, dark blue as well, because of the 7 at the end. And when I was a child and I was trying to imagine certain emotions, the first thing that came to me was not a word. It would often be those colours and those shapes and those emotions. And so if I was feeling shy, it was almost as if in my mind I was saying that I was feeling 4, like the number 4, because 4 is shy. Or if something was particularly beautiful, it would almost be like I was picturing the number 11, the beauty of the number 11. And that was beautiful for me. That was beauty itself. And so it was almost as though I were already a bilingual child, constantly translating between the world of numbers in my mind, the pictures and emotions that came to me with those numbers and the patterns of the numbers, and the world of other children, other people, the world of words. When I left school, I didn't go on to university. University would rather come to me years later when I became a distance learner with the Open University, and I earned a first-class degree in the humanities with them. And last year was awarded an honorary doctorate by the university. But rather than go to university, I went to Lithuania. I went to Baltics. I taught English, which is very ironic when you imagine the struggle that I had to acquire English. And no doubt the students were learning my English rather than perhaps the Queen's English. But it was an English that they found beautiful because I was describing it in a way that was meaningful to them. I wasn't using textbooks, I was using poetry and talking about the beauty of words and the emotion in words. And that seemed to really translate very well. And in return, they taught me Lithuanian, which was very interesting as well. And they told me stories about how important it was to speak up. For many years, as part of the Soviet Union, this was not very long after the fall of the Soviet Union, they hadn't been able to speak up. They hadn't been able to use their mother tongue at all. They'd only been able to use Russian. And so I was very naive. I was 19, and here I was learning all of these stories. My parents had been terrified at the prospect of me traveling overseas, as you can imagine, but they understood that it was important for me to open my horizons. They realized that I would not be comfortable in England. I felt more like I belonged overseas, so they encouraged me, and they knew I was with a program, a volunteer program, so it was, I was well surrounded, I was in good hands. And the women at the centre where I taught English were all my mothers, substitute mothers and grandmothers. They took great care of me. And when I came back, and I mentioned Pi, so when I came back from Lithuania and I was wondering what I was going to do with my life, a moment came when I realised that I wanted to share my story with other people, and I didn't yet have the words that I have clearly today to do so. And I remembered the number pi, the mathematical constant pi, which is something that everyone knows in school, up to 3 or 4 digits, normally 3.141. And I'd always been frustrated at that 3.141, the 3 dots after that. I wanted to know what was next, because I felt it was so frustrating only to have those few digits. It's like learning Shakespeare and only being given the first few words of Macbeth. And so I had read in books growing up the few pages that existed anywhere with numbers of the digits of pi, but there weren't very many. They don't get printed very often. And it was only when I came back from Lithuania and was awarded some money for my volunteer work for the year that I had spent overseas, and I was able finally my family to purchase a computer. It was the first computer we'd ever had, and with the computer we had internet, and I managed to find this website produced by a supercomputer in Tokyo, and the supercomputer's only point in existing was to calculate the digits of pi. So I was able to print out all of these sheets of paper filled with the digits of pi. And as you can imagine, I was completely over the moon and was reading these pages like, I guess, an actor reads a script, and discovering all of these wonderful, beautiful segments within pi, the different sequences of digits, and how I perceived them as so many landscapes with cliffs and hills and valleys. And I guess I was pouring my heart into this number. It was a way for me to tell my story, I realised, not with words, but with numbers. So when I contacted a charity that raised money for epilepsy research, having had epilepsy as a child, they were very keen on the idea of sponsoring me and supporting this idea, and I spent over 5 hours in the end reciting Pi without making a mistake. The mathematicians who were there, bless them, with their sharp pencils, just in case, having to check every single digit. But there were people there from every walk of life, I guess, as you are here today. And there'd been an article in the Times of London the morning of the recitation, I think it was. And so they knew to come and listen to this man speak in Pi. And they were fascinated, they were very curious. And so when they came and they listened, and they heard a young man, as I was then, embodying this number, something that was otherwise completely abstract, the concept of infinity. Pi is an infinite number. If you recited it forever, you would never reach the end. And they were, I guess, drawn to this person embodying this concept of infinity, bringing it into the room, sharing it with them, all of the digits that they never otherwise hear, the patterns within Pi that they can perceive, meaningful to each of them. It might be their postcode, it might be their date of birth, it might be, without them knowing it, their date of future death, their shoe size, their password on their computer, hoping no one else realizes that it's that. And some of them were moved to tears. And I remember seeing those tears and saying to myself, as I was reciting, that this was actually meaningful not only to me, but to other people as well. And I realized that if I had this gift, it wasn't for counting, it really was for recounting stories. And that's how I became a writer. ever since I've had this vocation to write. I've been very lucky to have a readership that has stayed with me all these years and growing in many parts of the world. 20 years ago when I first began writing, neurodiversity didn't exist, autistic writers didn't really exist. The very idea of an autistic writer was almost a contradiction in terms. The first publishers who received the manuscript of All on a Blue Day wondered if it was someone else who had written the book. They couldn't believe that an autistic man had written it. Later, the attitudes began to change, but they were still skeptical of my ability to actually practice any form of literature. And so that was one reason, one spur among others. It wasn't the only one, but one reason I wanted to continue each book going in new directions, whether it was essays or literary reportage, or for those who read in French, fiction. I've written poetry as well in both languages, English and French. And now with 9 Minds, I'm writing what we call creative non-fiction, narrative non-fiction. It's non-fiction, the stories are all true, that people really exist, and we're going to see what we're doing in a moment. Kaa speak to us for a couple of minutes by video. And but I used all the resources that literature gives us as writers. So there's dialogue, there's scene setting, there's description, metaphor, simile, everything that makes writing sing on a page, everything that makes it come to life as words do in my mind, with all the colours and the textures that come to me naturally. I'm trying to bring those same colours and textures and emotions into other minds, into the reader's minds. And so I began writing 9 Minds in 2019, just before COVID. I wrote the last chapter first, not knowing it was going to be necessarily the last chapter, obviously, at the time, and it was about the person who's the most famous person in the book, because most of the people in the book, all of them are extraordinary, as you'll find out. But some of them are, one of them is world famous, 2 of them are famous, and the others should be famous in a way, but in my mind they're famous anyway, but they're all extraordinary. And the one who is world famous is Daniel Tammet, the comic actor, who was the screenwriter and one of the main actors in Ghostbusters. That's the one that most people have seen, particularly if you're from my generation. We grew up on films like Ghostbusters. But he was also in Blues Brothers, he was in Changing Places, Eddie Murphy, he's done lots of films. And when I finally received my diagnosis at the age of 25, so 20 years ago this year, Dan Aykroyd had just given an interview on National Public Radio in the States, where he talks about having Asperger's, which was the word that we used then to describe high-functioning autism, or autism, the kind that I have and Dan has. And I remember listening to that and just being completely stunned, that this incredible comic actor, so famous, so extraordinary, identified as an autistic man. And what's so interesting is the interviewer almost didn't believe him. And that says so much about attitudes towards neurodivergent minds. The interviewer wondered if he was making a joke, because of course Asperger's is a very funny word. It sounds like Arsburger. If you want to make a joke out of it, you can very easily make a joke, particularly as he loves making those kinds of jokes, obviously. But he said, no, I'm being completely serious, hard as it is perhaps to believe, I'm being completely serious. And in interviews down the years, the interviewers would raise this subject, but in a way that was always very awkward and very as though you could really feel the self-consciousness and the awkwardness. And he just said very flatly, yes, of course, but he didn't want to go into that. He didn't want to talk about that necessarily anymore. That wasn't for him to do, but he was happy to acknowledge that it existed, and that was part of his story. And I wanted to learn more about his background and his journey. And no, it was impossible, obviously, to get in contact with him directly. He's a very private man, but I was very lucky. I have friends in Canada and family, for that matter, in the same part of Canada where he was born and raised. So some of the people I know actually went to school with Quaid. And I was able to collect, and because I'm fluent in both English and French, both the two official languages of Canada, I went to all the archives going back 50 years, 60 years, found a photo of him that no one's ever seen before when he was 11 or 12, I can't remember exactly how old he was, still young. And you really understand how he became the comic genius he became when you understand his personal journey with autism. And the attitudes, of course, that he would have confronted back then, even harsher than the ones that I had a generation later. And so I approached an editor who's here today, I noticed, Fred, and who I'd worked with a long time before with an article I published in a literary magazine. And my agent had tried to dissuade me to do the project because he thought we would never find a publisher for it. It was too regional, it was too creative, it was just too whatever it was, you know. And I showed it to Ed, this chapter about the Quaid, and he loved it. And because of that love, that support, we managed to get a contract. I managed to get a contract, I managed to write the other stories that make up 9 Minds. And so here it is, and it's coming out in numerous languages as well. So I think we've got a video, if Brian would like to show you a video, about a 2-minute video with one of the 9 Minds, who is Kaa Grace from Japan.
Hi everyone, my name is Kaa Grace. Thank you to the CRAE team for inviting me to give a video message. First of all, congratulations on the launch of 9 Minds. For the past 3 years, I've had many conversations with Daniel for my narrative in 9 Minds. Through these conversations, he has learned the details of my pain, challenges, and quirks far beyond what's written in the book, to say the least. Daniel, you have been a consistent and encouraging presence in my life during these years, and I'm so grateful to know you personally. I think many of you wonder, why this Japanese girl? That's been my thought exactly these past few years. I'm not special or great in any way, and I certainly wouldn't have chosen myself. When I asked Daniel why he reached out to me, I remember him saying, God works in mysterious ways, and he does. My narrative includes some of my darkest days, which I often wish to forget. I hope that bits of my life as seen through Daniel's eyes in 9 Minds will be helpful and hopeful to other neurodivergent people, their families, and those trying their best to understand them. Even though it's difficult for me, I hope that some people will hear my story and find something helpful, hopeful, and encouraging in it. And to Daniel, j'espère que les événements de lancement de livres se passeront bien. Et je te tiens toujours. Merci pour ce que tu as aidé pour moi. Et je vous laisse avec Philippienne vers ceci. Je suis persuadé que celui qui a commencé, on vous sait vous vers la fondeur parfaite pour le jour de Jésus-Christ. Thank you everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of today's book launch event.
I know about Kaa from the media. She had doing research into loneliness, which is a particularly it's a big issue everywhere, of course, for everyone. But for a long time, scientists did not consider that autistic people could feel lonely. Incredible as that sounds. There was an assumption that because of their autism, people on the spectrum are never lonely. They're so completely cut off from the world that they just never have any experience of loneliness. And Kaa, as myself, knew very well how wrong, obviously, that idea was, how absurd even the idea was. So she had dedicated time, energy, research into the study of loneliness. And what I found so interesting was this concept that CRAE and other centres, but not many centres, of bringing in autistic researchers, of actually not only having neurotypical scientists looking at the phenomenon of autism, neurodiversity, but actually inviting researchers who themselves have lived experience of autism to share those insights and simply to bring their own knowledge and own work ethic and talents into the research team. And I found that really interesting. It's underreported that's my understanding. I've seen very little reporting of it, and it seemed incredibly pertinent. So when I reached out to Kaa, she was very, as she said, very surprised and very flattered. And we spent a lot of time by video call and email exchanging. As you noticed that her English is fluent. And it's very interesting that, like myself, she always felt growing up completely foreign and wanted to, and was one reason why she went to America and Britain to do higher studies and to do her research, because she felt more comfortable in English, in the same way that in some respects, I'm very comfortable, as you can see, in English even so, but my everyday language is French. So for Kaa, her everyday language in many respects is English. She's spending a lot of time doing research in English, and the language she tells me she thinks in is in fact English. So we had these fascinating exchanges. She told me things about her own experience of loneliness, obviously, and how she imagines scientists researching a phenomenon like loneliness is such an abstract idea, So one way that I talk about in the book, in this chapter, Kaa's chapter, is the idea of measuring loneliness as we measure the wind. There's a scale, I don't know if you know the scale of, I think it's called the Beaufort scale, which measures the different kinds of, and if you haven't read this, please, when you have a moment, when you go home, look it up. It's pure poetry. It's beautiful how they describe each kind of wind. So it starts with a gust of a breath of air, and then it goes up to breeze, and then there's it goes all the way up to hurricanes, obviously, and typhoons. And with Kaa, there was also this idea in her research of doing something like this, finding a sort of universal scale for loneliness and measuring it in a way that could then be articulated in a way that would be very poetic, but primarily very simple, and that would be meaningful to everyone, neurotypical or neurodivergent. And I found that so beautiful, so poetic, so interesting, and it lent itself to the approach of Nine Minds, which is both a true story approach, but also, as I was mentioning, a kind of literary approach as well, really wanting to flesh out these individuals, because the media reporting that I had seen of Kaa, the very few mentions that I'd come across of her research, was very brief, very glancing, but I sensed there was a lot more there, both in terms of her research and her life story, and I was very, I was right to have that intuition. And very briefly, because I'd like to open the floor for questions if anyone would like to ask a question, anyone or everyone. Just to give an idea of the variety of the Nine Minds. I won't list all of them, but another one is Warren, who is a policeman. He's a detective. He's a murder detective. So he's not in TV. He's not a TV character. He really does exist. He's even in Birmingham, so he has a Birmingham accent and everything. So it's very funny. So very down to earth, very likable, very humble. He was very he almost didn't want to tell his story. He's, exactly like Hannah, a great deal of humility. I'm nothing special. Why do you come to me? Why are you? There had been one article in the local press in Birmingham, which I found online, about his story. And it was just, again, like Hannah, just very painting by numbers sort of writing, just very simple, and I thought there's so much here, there's so much I'd love to really discover, how do you become a murder detective, and how does his autism help him to solve murders? And he gave me an example of a case, and it forms the chapter in the book about Warren, about his life, that his neurotypical colleagues have not been able to solve. And thanks to his autism, thanks to the way that his mind works, he was able to find the solution. He was able to find the like in Hercule Poirot, he finds the guilty person. And I think he told me, again, you'll have to check the small print in the book, but I think he said that he'd solved, I think it's something like 92, there'd been 92 murders he worked on, and in the 92 cases, he'd helped solve all of them except for one. So that was a pretty good result, and that's one example, a very concrete example of how autistic minds help society, because as Anna was saying earlier very rightly, we've moved on from the approach of describing autism purely in terms of deficits and handicap and disability, and now it's much more a focus on strengths and talents. That doesn't take away the challenges that come with autism. I mean, that's something that I do bring up in the book. You really get the sense of the challenges and issues that autistic people have to face, whether that's because it's part and parcel of being human and being an autistic human, or because of the ways that society still treat people who are different, including people who are cognitively different. The